One day, the Alberta government decided to open up the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains to coal strip mining. They never bothered to ask Albertans if we thought that was a good idea. We didn't. No single issue has ever united people in this province like the fight to save our mountains and foothills from being stripped for their coal. Some of us care about scenery, others about fish and wildlife habitat. Still others about the absurdity of mining buried carbon in the midst of a climate crisis. But by far our biggest concern is water, because Alberta is a water-scarce province, and almost all of our water comes from those eastern slopes. Winter snows and spring rains soak into the green earth and become groundwater. Weeks later, that groundwater emerges into springs and wetlands, trout streams and rivers, water wells and lakes. It gives life to everything we love and everything we need. Unfortunately, coal strip mines are only the newest and worst threat to Alberta's eastern slopes and to our water supply.
Okay. Hello, I just said hello in the Blackfoot language. The water is very sacred to the Blackfoot people. The water beings, the spirits that are in the water, that come from the water, they're very powerful spirits. We use it in ceremony, and of course we survive on it. And so here in the headwaters of our territory, this is where the source of our water comes from. Glacier Park south of here, Waterton right here. These are the source, and they call these the eastern slopes all the way up to Banff. So it's a very important area, right now with the climate changing, the global warming, the glaciers are melting. Humans are diverting a lot of the water for agriculture and other uses. So water it's being threatened. And I worry about my children and my grandchildren. What I found out from our elders about some of the places in our territory, like over here at the Maskinonge wetland, is where we were given the beaver bundle by the water people, the water beings. So this is a very sacred place for the Blackfoot people. Carmangay is what it's called now. That was a really important camping area for us because there was good water there. So when our people traveled years ago, we covered a vast area. And this is why water is so sacred to us. We always knew where there was water. And we would usually camp where there was water and good shelter. If we don't have water, we won't live.
The east slopes are the water tower for southern Alberta. The east slopes provide the reliable year-long flow and the favorable condition that we need not only for our use, but also for the natural environment and also for our economic use, whether it's irrigation, industrial use, municipal use, the list goes on. This particular structure that we're on, the Lethbridge Northern Irrigation District Weir, was implemented a century ago, 1922, to allow for the diversion of water from this river, the Old Man River, off stream into a canal, and then it's dispersed throughout southern Alberta. But unfortunately, the water budgeting that we based the allocation on was in the beginning of the 1900s, which was naturally a very wet interval. So unfortunately, the budgeting, the banking, was based on a salary that wasn't sustainable. Further, climate change is amplifying the problem. This Old Man River has flows that are slightly declining year upon year upon year, but more substantially, the seasonal pattern is changing. With winter warming, we have a higher proportion of rain versus snow. We have rising snow line, and then we have earlier spring. These combine to reduce the snowpack to advance the snowmelt, and it means that unfortunately the flow of this river in late summer, when it's needed for irrigation and to keep the water cool and oxygenated for the trout, is declining.
Alberta rivers are either in plenty or poverty right now. As we've had temperatures 3 to 4 degrees above normal in July in this region, and of course exceptionally hot conditions starting in June. So the glaciers have been melting at 2/3 of a meter per week, where we've been measuring them, which is the highest rates ever. That would lead to about 7 meters of downward melting over the summer, and the rivers that are receiving glacier melt are raging right now. The Sunwapta River is running 2 to 3 times its normal flow for this time of year out of the Athabasca. This is all ice melt that's occurring. Interestingly, in early July, late June, the Bow River at Lake Louise was 2 times its normal flow for that time of year. But now it's dropped down to normal flows, and when you get down to the Bow River at Banff, it's below normal flows. And as you get into the Oldman, absurdly low flows. I mean, these things are almost dry. You could walk across them. So even where we have glaciers like the Bow Glacier, it's not making up for the lack of rainfall runoff and snowmelt runoff in the rest of the Bow River Basin. So the flows are below normal. The Oldman, which has minimal glacier coverage, is running incredibly low. And these are not sufficient to support the water withdrawals for irrigation that would be of interest right now under such dry conditions in the prairies. And then as you go further south to the Milk River, which arises in the foothills, the natural flows of the Milk River went to zero in early July and have stayed there all summer. They've shut down the Canadian irrigation part of that river basin, and so that's perhaps a harbinger of what we can expect for many of our foothills rivers and Southern Rockies rivers in the future as these types of events become more common and climate change becomes more severe.
A river integrates everything that goes on in that watershed. Every time we clear a hill slope with forestry, every time we put in a seismic road, we put in a pipeline, a power line, and especially roadways, we're allowing that water to drain more quickly and to pick up contaminants. And so healthy rivers absolutely need healthy watersheds.
There's very little headwaters here. If you take a look at BC, they have, from our continental divide, which you can almost see, they have thousands of kilometers of headwaters. We just have these little trickles heading out onto the dry prairies. And we've got to take care of that. You know, it's not just me and my fishing that I care about, it's all the Albertans, all the people downstream, all the way to Hudson's Bay that need this water to be clean. And the effects that I've seen in 25 years of living down here have drastically reduced the flows on all streams.
Up in the hills, our spring is a trickle, and usually it just is like a geyser coming out of our spring and feeds us, the house, which is like a seasonal cabin, feeds our house needs, 2 full tire troughs, overflows into a stream. And right now it's just a trickle. It can barely keep up.
We're in the Porcupine Hills, which is a range in front of the foothills. And we know that what happens out west in those mountains affects our springs. We don't necessarily understand that complex hydrology that comes from this massive formation of springs and small streams and runoff and groundwater that all comes out of the mountains. And we know that on low snowfall years and dry weather events like we're seeing, it really affects the quantity of water that comes out of the ground in those sandstone springs. Historically in our family, we heard that in the 80s was the only year that the spring had dried up. And now in our lifetime of management, we've had the spring dry up on us twice. 2019 was the first year it ground to a halt, and this year we're seeing it down to just a trickle.
The big thing is getting the infiltration, and it's always this combination of forest cover that on the cold slopes that traps snow and releases the snow melt, and the balance of rangeland that's healthy enough to infiltrate the water. and then quite often, like on this ridge, you have these sandstone outcrops, and water migrates and follows that sandstone as well. Having a good balance and a watershed that's in good shape, you can still reduce a lot of the flooding and try and capture that and release it. And the bench that that big outwash plain that we were, when you think about the gravels in those areas and you can see it across the valley, that can absorb a tremendous amount of water, and they go deep, and so they're not running off to the creek, and they come out days and weeks later.
When that water is delivered too quickly, we also ensure that we run out of water later in the season, because there's only a certain budget of water provided from snowmelt and spring rainfall. This is water that is coming off this slope. It's being intercepted by the road and the ditch. It should be underground, and if it was, it would be retaining its cool temperatures. It wouldn't be evaporating in these drought conditions, and it would be sustaining downstream flows in the Old Man River during this fall, during the winter, and that would be good for trout. And again, because sustained flows throughout the winter are good for us, humans benefit from this groundwater. But this is the issue when these roads cut so deeply that they intercept groundwater sources, that now this water is not doing us the type of good that it could be doing us.
I've seen some of the changes to that landscape through, new clear cuts in areas there really shouldn't be new massive clear cuts, through a lot of random motorized recreational use on trails that shouldn't be where they are, a lot of heavy land use pressures that we don't necessarily think about and have changed slowly enough that we're not noticing them on the landscape in the way that they have the significance on the landscape. We're seeing forestry issues and motorized recreation issues and heavy random camping and pressures that I think has become normal for some people, when really this place wasn't set up to support all of that type of land use pressure. It is our source water, our headwaters area, and that should be and is the most important use of this area, of our headwaters on the eastern slopes.
There's so many frustrations when it comes to talking about the policies that protect our land. When we have to fight to preserve the things that we see that have intrinsic value, from those of us who have our boots on the ground and we're on the back of a horse, we know what we have to lose. We should just assume that we can understand this data and the science that we have and move forward with stronger protections, or at least smarter ways of using the land, instead of just adding on more uses without understanding the cumulative impacts. We really need to look at all of the uses of our public lands and their regional and cumulative effects on things that are so important, like our water.
What we're dealing with is overlapping sectoral interests and overlapping government department interests that are often at odds with one another. And so we are not managing the eastern slopes as an entity, we're managing it in a competitive way between sectors. And as a consequence of that siloed approach to management, we get things like this coal exploration road, which didn't have to be. If the oil and gas industry has taught us anything about how to lighten our footprint in terms of the industrial uses of eastern slopes, it's with things like helicopter-assisted exploration programs and equipment, which could have been used here instead of driving all of these roads through some sensitive terrain that produces water, terrain that is extremely difficult to reclaim afterwards, and leaving behind, I think, an enduring legacy of costs for Albertans, because I don't believe that the coal exploration roads that coal companies have built are in any way it's possible to reclaim them in a way that restores ecological function and certainly hydrologic function.
Coal mining, things like that would just, of course, exacerbate this, and as well as mobilize selenium and sulfate and others, which are known disasters.
There's always an argument, and a valid argument, that the eastern slopes, have resources, and that those resources are useful. They're employment generators and money generators. I wouldn't think that most people would argue that there is that aspect. But I think we have to set some thresholds, some lines in the sand, over which we shouldn't go, because when we do, a lot of the values of the eastern slopes, beyond their economic values, start to disappear. Watershed values being one. Creation of high quality water, creation of stable water supplies, biodiversity in the form of threatened trout species and wildlife species and vegetation species, recreational attributes, and we've certainly seen that in spades as a consequence of the pandemic, is that people are starved for outdoor recreation opportunities, and the eastern slopes provides that in spades. But we can't have it all, everywhere, all the time, anytime.
So what I see is from man's activity up in our headwaters is increased silt, quick runoffs, and dropping river levels that the system just doesn't hold the water as long as it should. You can watch it on the graph on the computer. Say I'm floating the Castle River. One day it'll be 32 cubic meters of water. That's about when I put my raft in, so I can get through a canyon or two. And the next day it'll be 30. The next day it'll be 28. The next day it'll be 27. The next day it'll be 26. And so on and so on and so on. And when it gets to about 8 cubic meters of water, I'm done. I can't get a raft down there, and the water temperatures have usually soared. And so I used to get often, a month and a half or 2 months out of floating the castle, as an example. And the same would be true for the old man system where I float my rafts. And now I get 2.5 weeks. And then we're down to about 7 cubic meters of water. And if I can get my raft down there, it doesn't matter so much for my angling, because the water temperatures have risen so much because of that lack of water. We're running out of trout habitat, and in the headwaters, so as the trout habit, where the trout live, seems to be moving up to the headwaters, for some reason we're destroying those headwaters, and soon it'll be, possibly more or less over, and we won't have that recreational opportunity. We won't have those beautiful, cool streams to use for our families to recreate on.
As indicators, native trout tell us that the water is clean, cold, collected, and complex. And those have profound downstream impacts in terms of the water quantity that's available for us downstream water drinkers, the quality of the water that's available for us downstream water users and drinkers, as well as the recreational attributes, not only from the headwaters or in the headwaters, but throughout its entire length. And what we're rapidly doing is turning these clean, cold, connected, and complex systems into dirtier, warmer, fragmented, and significantly changed systems that don't suit either native trout or frankly us, because as native trout disappear, so do some of the attributes that we humans require. And so we should pay attention to the trout, because even though they don't have a language, they're trying to tell us something.
Most Albertans value water and believe in good land stewardship. The closer we are to the source of our water, the more we treasure it and work to keep our streams healthy.
So water is really the foundation for all life, but especially in a ranching operation. We can have all the grass in the world, but it's the water that really has to be our priority. We live in one place, we have cattle, multiple locations. How we manage the water in every spot really makes the whole puzzle come together. So depending on where the cattle are, we've got priorities of wintertime, heating the water, making it available. We've got springs to manage. We've got streams to make sure they stay out of the riparian areas. We've got to haul water for our family to drink. We love to drink the spring water in the hills. We bring it down home on the prairies so that we can drink the beautiful water. And right now, in a drought year, our springs in the hills are starting to dry up. So ironically, we're hauling water up to the hills. One thing that we think of in our operation, which is a multi-generational grass-fed beef operation, our kids are now going to the 5th generation. My husband and I consider ourselves just stewards of the land. We don't feel an ownership or a possession of the land. We feel like right now we have the responsibility and the blessings that come with that of being able to live and work with this land. But when we're making our decisions, we're thinking generationally. We're thinking about all the work that has gone into protecting and working with the land and the generations ahead of us to bring us to this point. And we're thinking about the decisions that we can make that impact the land and how we're going to leave it for the next generations. So we're really thinking in terms of the long term. How do we leave it better than we found it? And how do we get away from short-sighted decision making? If we turn this place into coal mines, we displace the regenerative, sustainable industries that are already working with the land.
You know, we have these periodic droughts that seem to be punctuated in 25 or 30 year intervals, and some of those creeks would dry up. So, you know, my folks thought that the beaver should come back into the country and approached forestry and got beaver brought in and introduced into those headwater creeks, and which is quite successful. We dam up the water and bring up the water table, and so that provided a water source more reliably, which also feeds the lower creek as well. It became a real project for my dad when I was growing up to try and restore those riparian areas and bring back health, and we also had a lot of seismograph activity in those headwaters, so we were packing a seed mix and trying to get those revegetated. And fortunately, the 70s brought in a fair amount of ATV traffic, and the damage just kept being more evident. And the unfortunate thing with a lot of those, especially seismograph trails, is they're just crossing the ridges and going straight down these slopes. So any disturbance on that would, it's a maximum kinetic energy for water going down, and those areas get cut.
Considering the importance ordinary Albertans attach to water and the security of our supply, wouldn't it make sense for our provincial government to take better care of the eastern slopes, the source of almost all that water?
You have to figure out some way of placing a value on it, because this is something that we just sort of take for granted. It's a service that isn't monetized directly. The yield on the upper 50,000 acres is about $94 million worth of water a year. And when I presented that in a talk to the Bow River Basin Council, they said, well, don't disagree with it, but why is the value so low? And so it's a fair question, because most of these municipalities supply water for people watering cattle or trees. They're going to pay around $7 a cubic meter for it. And if you go to the service station and get a 500 mill bottle, it's equivalent to about $4,400 a cubic meter. And I was pricing the Pekisko yielded $1.18 a cubic meter. When you think of the economic value and the value of being able to capture water and to have some influence on the flooding downstream as well, and building resilience, and there's definitely when you're thinking of $94 million, even at a low valuation, and you make a difference of a few percent in performance of a watershed, you can definitely invest in management.
I think we do need to look at that big picture and those high priority pieces first. We need to look at the water and its importance. We need to look at our native species and our threatened native species like West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout, and start from that baseline of what does the natural system look like, or what should it look like, and then plan from there about what is appropriate where.
You know, I started my career when the Forest Service still had district forest rangers out on the ground. And I remember working with several of them. And those guys, they were on all this stuff. They wouldn't have let something like this happen. They wouldn't have let someone get away from a messy campsite. They were on ranchers if they were a few days over their allotment time. You know, they were the guardians of the forest, and they viewed themselves as the guardians of the forest. And nowadays, people like that are missing in action. So there's just, there isn't a presence that looks up at this stuff in a professional way and deals with it consistently, so that industry and others, you know what the rules of the game are and are forced to adhere to those rules of the game.
The southwestern foothills and Rocky Mountains of Alberta, we, and this is the collective we, this is the government, this is the public, should appreciate these as first and foremost our water towers. So we need to rethink how we engage with this landscape. And a fortunate thing here is that conservation ethic is entirely compatible with recreational use and appreciation. The concepts of parks, protected areas are so essential and so complementary to that prime directive.
The idea of managing and or preserving the Rocky Mountain forest for water purposes is not new. In fact, it goes back to the Palliser expedition, who recommended to preserve the Rocky Mountains as a source of wood and water for the settlers who would eventually come anyway, and to preserve those natural ecosystem processes, which include hydroecological processes as part of their functioning. The soils that have built up over time in the Rocky Mountains are the reservoir. They will hold water for weeks to months, and our natural ponds and lakes and areas of groundwater recharge. These are all critically important and not particularly well understood. So I said the first thing is leave it alone, let it function as it can.
You know, when you look at this river that I'm sitting in, this is the Old Man River, just one of the many rivers that comes off the eastern slopes. When you look at this river, people in the other part of the world would probably laugh at us for calling it a river. Like in other parts of the world, this would be called a creek or even a brook. It's sort of a funny irony that we're one of the most heavy water users in Canada. We have 2/3 of all the irrigated agriculture in the entire country on the prairies, downslope from the eastern slopes, and we have the smallest streams feeding them. We have only a few rivers, and they're small by normal standards, by world standards. Ours just drop right off the continental divide. We've got this short little green zone along the edge of the eastern slopes that is the source of almost all our water, and we use a ton of water. If there's one thing that we know, is we can't make Alberta work without water. And it all hangs on how we treat the landscapes that produce these rivers, because there is no other source of water, and water isn't a product of the river. Water is a product of the landscape. The river is just an expression of what that landscape has given us and how it's given it to us. And I suppose if you were looking for something that would define the health of the river, you would look inside of it and say, how are the fish doing? Which is disconcerting because in Alberta, every stream-dwelling species of trout or grayling that's native to this province is now listed as being at risk. And that's got to be telling us something about the health of our rivers as they are today. And I guess what worries me is what will we learn in the future about the health of our rivers as they are tomorrow if we don't take better care of their headwaters.
The mountains and foothills of Alberta's eastern slopes provide us with almost all our water. But our rivers are running low, and the changing climate means every drop will soon be even more precious. It's time to recognize that every land use decision is a water management decision. It's time to heal the eastern slopes landscape and protect its ability to provide Alberta with clean, reliable water from healthy, trout-filled streams. Nothing matters to our future so much as water security. Nothing.